The operating room doors hissed shut in her face. The senior surgeon's voice was cold, final. "Enlisted personnel don't belong in my theater. Go find a mop." The young medic didn't argue. She just looked at her blood-caked gloves that, according to classified records upstairs, had performed 14 emergency surgeries in the dust of a firefight. The system saw a low-ranking woman. The records told a different story, one the surgeon was about to learn the hard way. Her name was Specialist Ava Cruz, a 24-year-old combat medic attached to a forward infantry unit. In the rigid hierarchy of military medicine, she existed at the bottom, an enlisted technician, not a commissioned officer or a surgeon. But on the battlefield, those distinctions evaporate. When seconds meant life or death, she was the only doctor for miles. This is the story of that credibility chasm between the badges on a uniform and the blood on your hands. And it begins with a single, classified after-action report that was about to land on that surgeon's desk. The report was from Operation Hammerfall, a brutal clearing mission in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, dated 6 months prior. In dry, clinical language, it detailed a mass casualty event where a patrol was ambushed in a narrow valley. The evacuation helicopter was 40 minutes out. The unit's senior medic was among the first casualties. The only medical provider left was Specialist Ava Cruz. On paper, her role was limited. Stabilize, bandage, wait for evac. But the report's annex contained a different narrative, one typed by a shaken platoon leader. It described how Cruz, under sustained machine gun and mortar fire, had performed what it called field-expedient surgical interventions. She used a pocket multi-tool to perform a cricothyrotomy on a soldier whose airway was crushed. She packed a liver laceration with hemostatic gauze and maintained direct pressure for 28 minutes until the bleeding stopped. Most strikingly, for a femoral artery rupture, a wound that typically kills in 3 minutes, she reportedly used a sterilized catheter from a saline IV as a makeshift shunt, threading it into the severed vessel to restore blood flow to the leg. She saved 3 lives that day with procedures far outside her official scope. But here, where the system's bias kicks in, when that after-action report filtered up through command, those details were anonymized. The heroism was credited to unit medical personnel. Cruz's name was buried in a roster, because in military bureaucracy, valor has a rank and credibility wears officers' insignia. Fast forward to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. This is where Ava Cruz was stationed after her deployment, a sprawling hub where war injuries meet stateside medicine. It's also a fortress of hierarchy. At the top were surgeons like Colonel Mark Thorne, a cardiothoracic specialist with 30 years in the Army Medical Corps. He ran his operating theater like a ship, and on his ship, roles were rigid. Cruz worked in the busy pre-op and post-op wards. To Thorne and his peers, she was part of the furniture, a capable pair of hands to change dressings and track vitals. They never asked what she'd done before arriving. They assumed she hadn't done anything of consequence. And this assumption wasn't just arrogance, it was systemic. A 2019 study of military medicine found a staggering gender and rank disparity in how clinical competence was perceived. Enlisted female medics routinely had their assessments of patient condition overruled by male officers, even when the data supported the medic's judgment. The system was wired to distrust them. So when a trauma alert blared through the hospital one Tuesday morning, a training accident with a simulated thoracic injury for a senior staff evaluation, Colonel Thorne stormed into the bay. He barked orders. His team scrambled, and Ava Cruz, seeing the simulated patient was a young medic from her old unit, recognized the signs of a tension pneumothorax from 30 feet away. The pressure building, the tracheal shift. She grabbed a 14-gauge needle from a crash cart. "What are you doing?" Thorne's voice cut through the chaos. He didn't wait for an answer. "Enlisted personnel don't belong in my theater. Go find a mop." The doors hissed shut. The humiliation was public, absolute. But the seed was planted. The medic she'd almost treated, Private First Class Benji Miller, knew exactly who she was. He'd been at Hammerfall. He was one of the 3, and he couldn't let it stand. Meanwhile, in a secure records room at the Pentagon, a different drama was unfolding. A data audit for a congressional oversight committee had flagged anomalies in after-action medical reporting. An analyst, poring over thousands of records, kept seeing the same pattern: extraordinary interventions credited to anonymous personnel attached to units where only one medic was present, and one name, Specialist Ava Cruz, kept appearing in the deployment rosters of those units. The analyst pulled the full, unredacted file for Operation Hammerfall. What she read didn't make sense. It described surgical techniques taught only at the Elite Special Operations Combat Medic course, a school so selective fewer than 200 medics graduate each year. But Cruz's file showed standard training. There was no record of her attending SOCM. Unless the record was wrong. The analyst dug deeper, cross-referencing classified deployment logs with medical supply manifests. She found a discrepancy. During Hammerfall, Cruz's unit had been issued a specific, high-end surgical kit, the kind only SOCM graduates were authorized to sign for. The signature on the log was blurred, but the request form had been approved by a field surgeon who was later killed in action. The trail was cold, but the evidence was mounting. Ava Cruz had resources and skills her official record denied. Back at Landstuhl, Cruz did what she was trained to do. She buried the humiliation and returned to work. But Colonel Thorne, a man whose identity was built on absolute control, couldn't let it go. He saw her calm not as professionalism, but as insolence. He ordered a review of her credentials, a routine check, he told himself, to ensure standards. His executive officer, a major named Elena Shaw, was tasked with pulling the file. Shaw was career medical administration, a stickler for rules. When she accessed Cruz's master record, she noticed something odd. 2 sections were locked behind a dual authentication firewall, advanced training and operational attachment history. The codes required to open them were above her clearance level, above even Colonel Thorne. When she reported this, Thorne dismissed it. A glitch, probably a data entry error tagging her with some Intel Weenie's file. But Shaw wasn't so sure. She'd seen those locks before, on the files of Delta Force medics and CIA surgical support teams, never on a specialist 4th class. The tension built in silence for a week. Then, Private Miller did something brave and stupid. He wrote a formal statement detailing the events of Operation Hammerfall, naming Cruz, and describing every improvised procedure. He submitted it not through his chain of command, but directly to the hospital's patient advocacy office, hoping it would force someone to listen. The advocacy officer, a civilian, didn't understand the protocol. She forwarded it to the hospital's commanding general as a personnel commendation. And that's when the clock started ticking. The general's aide, seeing the mention of classified operations, kicked it to the base security detachment. And base security, seeing potential violation of operational security protocols, flagged it for the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. Within 48 hours, 2 CID agents were sitting across from Ava Cruz in a sterile interview room. They weren't there to give her a medal. They were there because her name was now on a list attached to a potential disclosure of classified tactics, techniques, and procedures. Their first question was simple, and it changed everything. Specialist Cruz, can you explain how you learned to perform a battlefield femoral artery shunt using a catheter? Cruz looked at them, her expression unreadable. She knew the truth would end her career, but the lie was becoming impossible to hold. She took a breath and was about to answer when the interview room door flew open. It was Major Shaw, her face pale. She ignored the agents and spoke directly to Cruz. Don't say another word, your lawyer is on the way. One of the agents stood up. This is a federal investigation, Major. You can't interrupt. Shaw turned to him, holding up a secure tablet. I just can, because 5 minutes ago, a sealed packet from the Defense Intelligence Agency hit the General's server. It contains a full validation of Specialist Cruz's qualifications, and you two are not cleared for it. She looked at Cruz, her voice dropping. They know about the school. About the 14 operations, it's all real. The agents froze. Cruz simply nodded. The facade was over. But what happened next would be worse than any investigation, because Colonel Thorne had just been copied on the DI packet, and as he opened the file and began to read, his world of perfect order shattered. The first line of the summary read, Subject Cruz Ava, verification of covert SOCM graduation, Class 22 Alpha, confirmed participant in Operation Nightingale, Operation Pale Horse, Operation. Thorne scrolled, his blood running cold. The list of combat surgeries was not 14, it was 27. And the final entry was a procedure performed on a high-value target during a raid, a procedure Thorne himself had published a paper on, claiming it was first performed stateside. The date on Cruz's record was 18 months earlier, in a dusty compound outside Mosul. He closed the file. The silence in his office was deafening. He had not just humiliated a subordinate, he had barred a surgical peer from his operating room, a peer whose combat experience dwarfed his own. And now that truth was in the system, circulating to the very generals who decided promotions. His career, his reputation, his legacy, all of it was now balanced on the edge of a knife. And the person holding the knife was the woman he'd told to go find a mop. He picked up the phone. His hand was steady, but his voice was not. He called the hospital's command suite. "Get me the general, now." This was no longer about protocol. This was about survival, and Colonel Thorne was about to make a move that would turn a personal disgrace into an institutional war. The call connected, but General Reed wasn't angry. He was quiet, too quiet. "I've seen the packet, Mark," he said, using Thorne's first name, which was never a good sign. "Sit tight. Do not contact Specialist Cruz. Do not discuss this with anyone. A containment team from the Inspector General's office is already en route to you." The line went dead. Containment team. Those words meant one thing: this was no longer a personnel issue. It was a potential scandal, and the Army's first instinct was to seal every leak. The DI packet wasn't just a personnel file. It was a forensic timeline. It laid out a parallel career for Ava Cruz that existed in the shadows. 18 months prior, while officially stationed at Fort Sam Houston for advanced trauma training, she had been quietly recruited into a pilot program called Project Nightingale. The brainchild of a retired special operations surgeon, Nightingale's thesis was brutal and simple. The future of battlefield medicine wasn't in more surgeons, but in creating medics who could act as surgical surrogates in denuded areas. They identified candidates with off-the-charts spatial reasoning and stress tolerance. Cruz scored in the 99th percentile. Her official records were never updated. For 10 months, she underwent a grueling, classified curriculum that blended surgical principles with guerrilla medicine. She learned how to perform a burr-hole craniotomy with a battery-powered drill, how to do a rapid field amputation with minimal blood loss, how to maintain sterile fields in sandstorms. She graduated, but her certification was locked in a vault at the Pentagon, accessible only to mission planners conducting high-risk, low-profile operations. She became what the packet called a Tier 3 medical asset, a ghost in the system. This explained the 27 combat surgeries. They weren't just desperate improvisations. They were the controlled application of forbidden knowledge. Operation Pale Horse, for instance, was a hostage rescue in Yemen. The packet contained a satellite image with a grid coordinate. The after-action report, now declassified for Thorne's eyes, stated, "Primary medic incapacitated." Asset Nightingale 7 performed a successful pericardial window to relieve cardiac tamponade on a team member, followed by a shrapnel extraction from the thoracic cavity using modified instruments. Patient stabilized for 6-hour ground evac. Survival attributed to asset intervention. Asset Nightingale 7 was Ava Cruz. She had opened a soldier's chest in a dirt-floored shack, and she had done it alone. But Project Nightingale had a fatal flaw. It was too successful, and it threatened too many institutional empires. The Army Medical Corps saw it as a dangerous dilution of surgical authority. The official surgeons' lobby in Washington argued it violated the principles of medical ethics, putting patients in the hands of non-doctors. 6 months ago, under political pressure, the Secretary of Defense quietly terminated the program. All records were to be sealed, all assets returned to conventional units, their special training never to be acknowledged. Ava Cruz was supposed to fade away, a hidden weapon placed back in the armory, forgotten. Private Miller's statement had pulled the pin on that grenade. While Thorne sat frozen in his office, the containment team landed. They weren't military police. They were 2 sharply dressed civilians from the Army's Office of the Inspector General and a stoic lieutenant colonel from the Judge Advocate General's Corps. They sequestered Thorne, took his computer and phone, and began a hostile, detailed debrief. Their questions weren't about Cruz's skills. They were about Thorne's actions. Why did you bar her from the theater? Did you review her full service record before doing so? Were you aware of any atypical training? They were building a case, but for what? Against whom? Thorne realized, with dawning horror, that he might be the designated fall guy for the entire Nightingale cover-up. Across the hospital, Ava was escorted not to a lawyer, but to a secure conference room. Waiting for her was a woman she'd never met, Dr. Liana Aris, the civilian epidemiologist from the Pentagon who had first connected the data dots. Aris didn't work for CID, she worked for the Defense Health Agency's Oversight Board. She pushed a copy of her own analysis across the table. I'm not here to investigate you, specialist. I'm here because the data says you were failed. The system you saved has spent 6 months pretending you don't exist. Aris showed her the graphs, the mortality rates for similar wounds treated by standard medics versus the outcomes from Cruz's documented interventions. The difference was statistically overwhelming. Cruz's patients had a 74% higher survival rate in the first critical hour. You proved the concept, Aris said. And they buried it. Now, because a colonel's ego collided with a private's conscience, it's out. You have a choice. You can let them contain this, which means you'll be quietly transferred to a desk job in Alaska and Nightingale dies forever. Or you can fight to have your training and your work recognized. But I warn you, the institution will fight back harder. Ava asked the only question that mattered. What happens to Private Miller and the others who spoke up? Aris's face tightened. They've already been reassigned. Miller is on a transport to South Korea as we speak. The message is being sent. The game was clear. Exposing the truth would protect no one. It would only burn her and everyone around her. But accepting the lie meant the next soldier with a femoral artery bleed would die waiting for a surgeon who might never arrive. She was trapped. Then the first external shockwave hit. A reporter for a major military affairs website who had cultivated sources in medical logistics caught wind of the IG team's sudden deployment to Landstuhl. He started digging. He found the reassignment orders for Miller and 2 other Hammerfall veterans. He found the sealed court-martial docket for a sergeant major who tried to submit a Medal of Honor recommendation for Cruz that was lost at battalion level. He connected the dots into a shape that looked like a cover-up. His story went live at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. The headline was a missile, decorated combat medic silenced, Pentagon program Nightingale buried after saving lives. It named Ava Cruz, it named Colonel Thorne, it described the MOP incident in detail, and it included a leaked, redacted slide from the original Nightingale proposal that read, "Surgical outcomes independent of provider rank or gender." The Army's public affairs machine went into overdrive, issuing a terse, no comment on ongoing internal reviews. But the dam was breached. Online forums used by medics and corpsmen erupted. Stories poured out. A Navy corpsman described being berated for performing a needle decompression by a Marine doctor who later took credit for the save. An Air Force pararescueman talked about the rigid boundary between operator medics and real doctors. The Cruz case became a lightning rod for a decades-old, smoldering resentment across the entire military medical community. In the White House, a deputy national security advisor whose son was a combat medic saw the story. He sent a blunt email to the Secretary of Defense. Is this true? And if so, why are we sidelining our best people? The question cascaded downward with the weight of the Oval Office behind it. General Reed was now caught between the Inspector General's containment order and a political firestorm. He made a decision. He ordered Colonel Thorne to reinstate Ava Cruz to full clinical duties pending the outcome of the review. It was a public relations move meant to show good faith. For Thorne, it was a personal hell. The woman whose competence he had publicly denied would now be working, ostensibly, under his command. The first time they passed in the hallway after the order, the silence was physical. Thorne expected to see triumph in her eyes. He saw nothing, just the same calm assessment she'd given the simulated trauma patient. It unnerved him more than any glare could have. She wasn't interested in defeating him. She was following a different protocol entirely. Driven by a mix of guilt and desperate self-preservation, Thorne did something unprecedented. He went to the hospital's medical library at night and pulled every declassified document, every study he could find on enlisted medic performance under fire. The data was undeniable. Study after study, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, showed that the key variable in battlefield survival wasn't the sophistication of the hospital, but the speed and skill of the first responder. The very person he had dismissed as help. He also found the archived personnel file of Project Nightingale's founder. The name made him go cold. It was Dr. Robert Aris, a legendary trauma surgeon who had resigned from the military in protest 20 years ago over, and Thorne read the old memo, the Medical Corps, elitist obstruction of tactical medical advancement. Dr. Liana Aris, the Pentagon analyst now helping crews, was his daughter. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a reckoning decades in the making, and Mark Thorne, champion of the surgical establishment, had walked directly into its path. He realized then that saving his career was impossible. The only thing left was to try and salvage something from the wreckage. He requested a private meeting with General Reed. When they met, Thorne didn't defend himself. He placed a summary of the Nightingale outcome data on the desk. "Sir, we were wrong, not just me. The whole system. We terminated the single most effective force multiplier in combat medicine in a generation because it didn't fit our hierarchy. I will resign my commission if that's the price. But before I do, I formally request that specialist cruises training be formally recognized and that the Nightingale protocols be reviewed for reinstitution." Reed stared at him. "You're asking me to overturn a SecDef decision." "I'm asking you to look at the numbers, sir," Thorne said, his voice hollow. "She saved 27 lives. How many have we lost in the past 6 months because we forgot how she did it?" The meeting ended with no resolution, but the argument had been placed on the record, and now the forces arrayed against that argument mobilized. The next morning, an op-ed appeared in a prominent medical journal, authored by 3 senior military surgeons. Its title was "The Peril of the Half-Trained Surgeon." It didn't name crews, but the target was clear. It argued that allowing medics to perform surgical procedures, no matter the circumstance, eroded medical standards and endangered patients. It cited the risk of complications, the lack of formal residency, the threat to the chain of medical authority. It was the institutional counterpunch, framed as a matter of ethics and patient safety. Ava read it in the hospital cafeteria. Then she stood up, walked to the surgical wing, and instead of putting on scrubs, she walked to the central nursing station. She asked the head nurse for the log of all trauma cases from the past month. Then she did something no specialist had ever dared to do. She began her own audit. Using the treatment codes, she pulled every file for patients with specific, time-sensitive injuries: tension pneumothorax, catastrophic hemorrhage, airway obstruction. She charted the timeline from admission to definitive intervention. Then she compared it to the average response times documented in her own Nightingale after-action reports. The discrepancy was staggering. The hospital's average time to treatment for a tension pneumothorax was 22 minutes. Her average in the field, under fire, was under 90 seconds. She compiled the data into a simple 1-page chart. No commentary, just times, procedures, and outcomes. She made 20 copies, and at the start of the daily surgical staff meeting, which Colonel Thorne was required to attend but was now forbidden from leading, she walked into the conference room. Every senior surgeon, every department head, fell silent. She didn't look at Thorne. She placed a copy of the chart in front of every person at the table. "For your situational awareness," she said, her voice clear in the dead quiet. Then she turned and left. The chart circulated through the hospital like a virus. It was undeniable, factual, and it came from the source. It made the op-ed's theoretical arguments look hollow. The moral high ground of the surgeons was crumbling under the weight of hard numbers. But the institution had one more card to play. Late that afternoon, Ava was summoned to the office of the hospital's command sergeant major. Waiting with him was a full-bird colonel from the Army's Human Resources Command. The colonel offered a deal. "Specialist crews, this controversy is damaging readiness and morale. Effective immediately, you are offered a direct commission to the rank of captain in the Army Nurse Corps. You will attend an accelerated nursing program, then apply to the Army's Physician Assistant School. In 5 to 7 years, you can become a fully credentialed provider. The past will be regularized. Your record will be cleansed." It was a bribe, a generous, career-making bribe. It was also the ultimate negation of everything she was. They were offering to make her a proper officer in exchange for her agreeing that what she had done as an enlisted medic was illegitimate, a stepping stone to a real career. They were asking her to validate the very hierarchy that had tried to erase her. She looked at the sergeant major, a man who had risen from the ranks. He gave her a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. "Don't do it." Ava stood up. "Thank you for the offer, sir. I will consider it." She walked out, leaving the commission papers untouched on the desk. She went to the one place she could think, the hospital chapel. She wasn't praying, she was waiting. She knew the offer wasn't the end. It was a test. Refusing it would trigger the next and final phase of the Army's response. They would stop trying to co-opt her and start trying to break her. She was right. As she sat in the quiet gloom, Dr. Liana Aris found her. The analyst's face was grim. "They've convened a board of inquiry," she said. "Officially, it's to examine the Nightingale program's legality and clinical outcomes. Unofficially, it's a show trial. They've stacked it with 3 surgeons who publicly opposed the program. Their mandate is to determine if your actions, while tactically effective, constituted the unauthorized practice of medicine. If they rule against you, the Army will have a legal basis to strip you of your medical credentials altogether. You could be discharged, not as a hero, but as a medical liability." Ava finally showed a flicker of emotion, a faint, cold smile. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that you acted outside your scope of practice as defined by Army regulations," Aris said. "The regulations written by the surgeons on the board. And my patients, the ones who lived, will be irrelevant. The board isn't judging outcomes, it's judging compliance." The trap was sprung. The Army would use its own rules to retroactively criminalize her success. The hearing was in 72 hours, and as Ava absorbed this, a new player entered the game. A civilian lawyer from a powerful firm that specialized in military whistleblower cases had been watching the media storm. He called the hospital, demanding to speak to specialist crews. He told the switchboard operator his name, and the message was relayed to Ava. The name meant nothing to her, but it sent a shock through the JAG office, because that lawyer had never lost a case against the Department of Defense, and he just volunteered to represent her pro bono. The fight was no longer inside the Army. It was about to go to war with it, and as Ava walked out of the chapel to take the call, she passed a wall mirror. For a second, she saw not a specialist 4th class, but Nightingale 7, the ghost they created, the ghost that was now haunting the halls of power. She picked up the phone. The lawyer's first question was simple. "Specialist crews, are you ready to make them justify on the record why letting soldiers die is better than letting you save them?" She said yes, and that single word turned a personnel dispute into a constitutional case. Her new lawyer, David Clay, had a reputation for surgically dismantling Pentagon bureaucracy. His first move wasn't to file a lawsuit. It was to send a series of Freedom of Information Act requests so precise they acted like scalpels. He requested all internal communications regarding Project Nightingale's termination. He requested the performance reviews of every member of the Board of Inquiry, and he requested the service records of every soldier Ava Cruz had treated, with outcomes noted. He was building a mosaic, and the picture was damning. The Board of Inquiry convened in a secure briefing room at the Pentagon. It was not a courtroom, but it felt like one. The 3 presiding officers were, as predicted, senior surgeons. Presiding was Brigadier General Cynthia Moore, a renowned trauma surgeon with a reputation for rigid adherence to protocol. Flanking her were Colonel David Park, a cardiothoracic specialist, and Colonel James Harris, former head of the Army's Medical Ethics Committee. Their faces were unreadable. Ava sat at a small table with Clay. Across the room sat the Army's legal counsel, and in a separate section, Colonel Thorne, present as a witness. Thorne looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. General Moore opened proceedings. "This board is tasked with determining whether the medical interventions performed by specialist crews while deployed constituted a violation of Army Medical Command regulations and the Uniform Code of Military Justice as it pertains to the practice of medicine. Let us be clear, we are not here to judge outcomes, but compliance." Clay stood up. With respect, General, you cannot separate the two. Compliance exists to ensure positive outcomes. If the outcomes were positive and the only violation was a line on an organizational chart, then the chart is wrong. The first day was a brutal slog through regulations. The Army's lawyer meticulously cited Army manuals, pointing out that every procedure cruise performed, from the cricothyrotomy to the vascular shunt, was listed as physician or physician's assistant only. Cruz's defense was, on paper, non-existent. She had broken the rules, repeatedly. Then Clay called his first witness, not a medic, not a surgeon. He called Dr. Liana Aris. She was sworn in, and Clay had her walk the board through her data analysis, the survival rates, the time to treatment charts. She presented a graph that showed a direct correlation. As the Nightingale-trained medics were withdrawn from rotation, the mortality rate for certain time-sensitive injuries in forward areas had ticked upward by a statistically significant 8%. Colonel Harris interrupted. Dr. Aris, correlation is not causation. Many variables affect battlefield mortality. Aris didn't blink. You're correct, Colonel, which is why I controlled for those variables. Enemy activity rates, evacuation times, injury severity scores. The only variable that changed was the removal of the advanced provider. The result stands. The room was silent. Clay then entered into evidence the declassified after-action reports. He had them displayed on a large screen. He read aloud the clinical details, then pointed to the outcome line: patient survived, evacuated stable. He did this 27 times. After the 10th, the repetition became a hammer. This wasn't about one procedure. It was about a pattern of success that the rules said was impossible. On the second day, the Army played its trump card. They called a sworn statement from the Under-Secretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, the official who had signed Nightingale's termination order. The statement argued the program was shut down not due to its results, but due to unacceptable legal and ethical risk. It claimed that without the full rigors of a surgical residency, these medics could not guarantee consistent safety or recognize complex complications, potentially causing harm. It was the peril of the half-trained surgeon argument, given the weight of the Pentagon. Clay stood for cross-examination of a piece of paper. He addressed the board. This statement claims an unacceptable risk. I enter into evidence the risk that was accepted. He then played a video deposition. It was a man in his late 20s, sitting in his living room, walking with a slight limp. He identified himself as Sergeant First Class Marcus Johns. On November 12th, Johns said, looking directly into the camera, "My convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar. My right leg was almost severed. The medic with us, he was good, but the bleeding, he couldn't stop it. I was fatting. Then a bird landed. It was a medevac, but not for us. It was dropping off a team. Specialist Cruz was on it. She saw me, assessed me in under 30 seconds, and told my medic to get her a specific kit from her pack. She did something with a tube right there in the dirt. I felt the pain in my foot come back. She told me later she'd shunted my femoral artery. The surgeon at Bagram said if she'd arrived 5 minutes later, or if she hadn't done exactly what she did, I'd have lost the leg. Maybe my life. She wasn't my medic. She wasn't assigned to me. She just saw a soldier dying and used the skills she had. The risk was me bleeding out. The unacceptable part would have been her walking away." The deposition ended. The Undersecretary's statement about abstract risk now lay on the table next to the living, breathing result of breaking the rules. The atmosphere shifted. The board members exchanged glances. Then General Moore called Colonel Thorne to the stand. The Army's counsel led him through the events of the MOP incident, establishing his concern for protocol and patient safety. Then Clay approached. "Colonel Thorne, you barred Specialist Cruz from your operating room because she was enlisted, correct?" "I barred her because she was not credentialed for the procedure being simulated," Thorne replied, sticking to the script. "But you didn't check her credentials first, did you?" "There was no time. It was a simulated trauma alert." "So you assumed," Clay said, "based on her rank and her uniform. Now, after reviewing the Nightingale packet, do you believe Specialist Cruz could have successfully performed the needle decompression required in that simulation?" Thorne hesitated. The entire room leaned in. This was the moment. He could uphold the institution, or he could speak the truth. He looked at Ava, then at the board. His voice was low but clear, based on the documented evidence of her performing far more complex procedures under combat conditions. Yes, I believe she could have. A murmur rippled through the room. It was a small concession, but from him, it was an earthquake. No further questions, Clay said. But then the unexpected pivot. Colonel Park, the cardiothoracic surgeon on the board, leaned forward. Colonel Thorne, you've seen the data. In your professional opinion, as a commander of surgical services, if the evidence shows these techniques save lives, should the rules change? Thorne was silent for a long moment. He seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds. When he spoke, it wasn't the voice of a colonel defending his domain. It was the voice of a doctor who had just seen his own dogma fail. The rules exist for good reasons, to maintain standards, to prevent harm. But if the rules themselves become the cause of harm, if they prevent a capable person from acting to save a life when no one else can, then we are not practicing medicine. We are practicing bureaucracy, and soldiers die for our paperwork. He looked directly at General Moore. I was wrong, not just about her, about the whole damned thing. The hearing adjourned for the day in stunned silence. Thorne's testimony had just blown a hole in the Army's case, but the institution wasn't finished. That evening, a sealed packet was delivered to the board members' quarters. It contained new evidence. Personnel complaints filed against crews during Nightingale training by 2 instructors, alleging overconfidence and resistance to supervisory feedback. They were minor, bureaucratic black marks, but in a hearing about compliance, they were poison. Clay was furious. He demanded to see the original complaint forms. When they were produced, he noticed something: the dates. The complaints were filed in the final week of Nightingale training, the same week the program's termination was being debated in Washington. It reeked of a setup. He spent the night on the phone. By morning, he had a countermove. He subpoenaed the 2 instructors. One, now retired, refused to testify. The other, a major still serving, was compelled to appear. Under oath, Clay asked him about the timing. The major was evasive. Then Clay asked a simple question. Major, were you instructed by anyone to document negative observations on specialist crews? The major froze. I don't recall. Let me refresh your memory, Clay said. He entered an email chain into evidence. It was between the major and a lieutenant colonel in the Army's G1 personnel office. The subject line was Nightingale trainee assessments. The lieutenant colonel's email read, ensure all trainee files are complete with balanced feedback for archival. The major's response, understood, will finalize. The date was 2 days before the complaints were filed. Balanced feedback, Clay repeated to the board. That's bureaucrat for find some dirt. This wasn't a performance assessment. It was a preemptive smear generated because they knew this day might come. This isn't evidence, it's fraud. The board was in chaos. General Moore called for a recess. The legal and ethical ground was crumbling beneath their feet. During the recess, Clay received a phone call. It was from a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was quiet, measured. Mr. Clay, there's another file. It wasn't in the DI packet. It's called the Nightingale Extended Evaluation. It's a 5-year outcome study on every patient treated by Nightingale personnel. It compares their long-term recovery and quality of life against matched patients treated through standard channels. The results are conclusive. The file is classified secret, compartmentalized. The access code is 7 Alpha Foxtrot 9 3 Zebra. You have 20 minutes before they lock it down. The line went dead. Clay didn't hesitate. He called Dr. Aris, who still had her Pentagon data access. He gave her the code. 23 minutes later, as the board reconvened, Aris rushed into the room, her face alight with a ferocious triumph. She handed a printout to Clay, who immediately moved to enter it as evidence. What is this? General Moore demanded. This, General, is the It Gets Worse file, Clay said. The Nightingale Extended Evaluation, conducted by the Army's own Medical Research and Development Command. It tracks patients like Sergeant Johns for 5 years post-injury. It measures physical recovery, mental health outcomes, return-to-duty rates. And it finds that patients treated by Nightingale-trained personnel have a 30% higher rate of full functional recovery. They have lower rates of chronic pain. Lower rates of PTSD. They are more likely to stay in the military if they choose to. The program didn't just save lives on the battlefield, it gave those soldiers better lives afterward. And someone buried this report a year ago. He placed the summary page in front of each board member. The header read, "Conclusion, tiered medical training model demonstrates significant and sustained improvement in long-term casualty outcomes, recommended for immediate expansion." For the first time, General Moore looked genuinely shaken. The Army's own secret research had validated everything crews had done and recommended doing more of it. The board's mandate to judge compliance was now a joke. They were being asked to condemn a soldier for excelling at a program their own scientists said should be expanded. The Army's lawyer requested an immediate, indefinite adjournment. The board granted it. The hearing was in freefall. But the victory was fragile. As Ava and Clay left the building, they were met by a public affairs officer and a phalanx of reporters. The story had leaked, not the details, but the fact of the secret report. The headlines that night were brutal for the Pentagon. Army hid data proving medic program worked. The narrative flipped from rogue medic to institutional cover-up. Pressure exploded from Congress. The House Armed Services Committee announced hearings. The Senate demanded the Secretary of Defense testify. Project Nightingale was no longer a bureaucratic secret, it was a political scandal. And in the middle of it all, Ava Cruz received new orders. She was being temporarily assigned to the Pentagon, to the Office of the Army Surgeon General, not as a defendant, as a subject matter expert. It was a classic maneuver: absorb the threat, control the narrative. They wanted her inside the building, where they could watch her, where her testimony could be guided. Clay advised against it. Ava accepted. "If they want me in the room where they make the decisions," she told him, "then that's where I need to be." Her first day at the Pentagon, she was given a badge, a cubicle, and a stack of meaningless reports to review. It was a gilded cage. But at noon, a sergeant major she'd never met stopped by her desk. He didn't make eye contact. He just placed a small, folded note next to her keyboard and walked away. She opened it. It contained 3 words: "Check secure drop. Bravo." She waited until after hours. Using an old protocol from her Nightingale days, she accessed a secured, anonymized messaging system on a terminal in the library. In the Bravo folder was a single document. It was a draft memo from the Surgeon General's office to the Secretary of the Army. The subject: recommendation for resolution of the Cruz case. The proposed resolution was not to reinstate Nightingale. It was to create a new, token Advanced Tactical Medic badge, award it to Cruz and a handful of others for exceptional service, and then quietly strengthen the regulations to ensure such a situation could never happen again. It was a medal and a muzzle. The memo ended with a chilling line: "This action will preserve medical authority while addressing political pressure. Specialist Cruz's cooperation can be secured through the offer of a commission and a future role in training development, contingent on her public support of this new, limited paradigm." They weren't going to expand the program. They were going to create a decorative award for past deeds, then lock the door even tighter. They wanted to buy her silence with a captain's bars and a desk job designing PowerPoint slides. Ava sat back in the dark library. The fight had never been about her record. It was about power, the power to define who was a healer and who was just help. And she realized the board, the hearings, the data, none of it mattered if they still held that power. She had to attack the foundation itself. She typed a response into the secure drop, addressed to the unknown sender. "Understood. What's their biggest fear?" The reply came an hour later. One word: precedent. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, she didn't go to her cubicle. She went to the office of the Army's Vice Chief of Staff, the second highest-ranking officer in the service. She didn't have an appointment. The aide tried to stop her. Ava looked at him, not with anger, but with the absolute certainty of someone who has faced worse. "Tell the General Specialist Cruz is here. Tell him I'm not asking for my job back. I'm here to discuss how many soldiers we're going to lose next year, because we're having this meeting instead of training them." The aide stared, then picked up the phone. 2 minutes later, Ava was walking into a corner office with a view of the Potomac. General Daniel Cartwright was a combat infantryman, not a doctor. He'd lost men waiting for medevacs. He gestured to a chair. "You have 5 minutes, specialist." Ava didn't sit. She placed a single sheet of paper on his desk. It was the data from the long-term study, distilled to one number. 30% better recovery, General. That's not a medical statistic. That's 30% more sergeants, 30% more fathers, 30% more taxpayers. The system is sacrificing them to protect its own hierarchy. You spent your career asking soldiers to risk their lives. I'm asking you to risk a little paperwork. Cartwright studied the number, then her face. "What do you want?" "Not a medal, not a commission. I want a pilot program. Let me take 10 medics. Give me 6 months. Train them the Nightingale way. Then deploy them and measure the results against 10 matched units with standard medics. Let the data decide, not a board of surgeons who have never had to tourniquet a leg in the dark. And if I say no, then the next soldier who dies from a treatable wound because the right person wasn't allowed to treat them." She paused. "That blood won't just be on the system's hands, sir. It'll be on yours, and I will make sure everyone knows you had the choice." It was the boldest, most dangerous move of her life. She wasn't appealing to justice. She was issuing a threat wrapped in a tactical proposition. General Cartwright's expression didn't change. He looked out the window for what felt like an eternity. Then he picked up his phone. "Get me the Surgeon General and the Secretary of the Army. Tell them we need to talk. Today." He hung up and looked back at Ava. "Wait outside." She walked out, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't know if she'd just ended her career or started a revolution. But the waiting was over. The battle for the future of battlefield medicine had just moved from the hearing room to the highest office in the army. And the decision they made in the next hour would determine whether the story of Specialist Ava Cruz was a tragedy or the first chapter of a new doctrine. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When General Cartwright's aide finally opened the door and motioned Ava inside, the atmosphere had changed. The Surgeon General, a 4-star general named Preston, was there, along with the Secretary of the Army's Chief of Staff. Their expressions were unreadable, but the defensive posture was gone. They looked like accountants who had just found a massive, undiscovered liability. General Cartwright spoke first. "Specialist Cruz, the pilot program is approved. You'll get your 10 medics. You'll get 6 months, but it will be under a joint command with oversight from both Medical Command and Forces Command, and you will not be in charge of it." Ava's heart sank. It was a compromise. They were giving her the test, but taking away her voice. Then the Surgeon General cleared his throat. "You will, however, be the senior enlisted advisor to the program director. Your role will be curriculum development and direct field assessment. The director will be Colonel Mark Thorne." Ava froze. She looked at Cartwright, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. This was the move. Thorne, the man who embodied the old system, was being given the chance to dismantle it. His career rehabilitation was now tied to the program's success. It was a brutal, elegant piece of institutional judo. If he failed, he took the fall. If he succeeded, the Army could claim the reforms came from within its own leadership. "Do you accept these terms, Specialist?" General Preston asked. Ava thought of the alternative, a quiet desk job, a muted victory. This was messy, risky, and placed her fate in the hands of the man who had humiliated her. But it was real. It was a chance to change the manual, not just get a footnote in it. "Yes, sir, I accept." "Good, dismissed." The pilot program, dubbed Guardian Angel, launched 60 days later. The 10 medics were selected not from top medical schools, but from combat units. They were corporals and sergeants with multiple deployments, proven under fire. The training was held not at a sterile medical center, but at the Army's grueling Ranger School grounds. The curriculum Ava designed mirrored Nightingale, but with one critical addition: legal and ethical frameworks. She was building a program that could survive bureaucratic scrutiny. Colonel Thorne, to his credit, did not interfere. He handled the logistics, the budgets, the reports to Washington. He became the shield, absorbing the pressure from above while Ava forged the weapon. They spoke only when necessary, a cold but professional truce. Observers noted Thorne began spending more time on the training field, watching, taking notes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a student. 6 months later, the Guardian Angel teams deployed with infantry units to 3 different training exercises designed to simulate high-intensity conflict. The results were tracked in real time by a neutral team from the RAND Corporation. When the final report landed, it was unequivocal. Units with Guardian Angel medics showed a 40% reduction in preventable combat deaths in the simulation. The medics performed every procedure to standard. There were no legal violations, no half-trained mistakes. The data was bulletproof. Based on that report, the Army announced a permanent change. A new military occupational specialty was created, the Advanced Tactical Medical Specialist. It came with a formal, published scope of practice that included the procedures from Nightingale. It required a new, grueling selection course. And for the first time, it offered a legitimate, respected career path for enlisted medical personnel to become technical experts without needing to become officers. The wall between medic and doctor remained, but now it had a gate. For Ava Cruz, the offer of a commission was renewed. This time, it was for the rank of major to help stand up the new schoolhouse. She declined again. Instead, she accepted a promotion to Sergeant First Class and a position as the inaugural senior instructor of the new specialty course. She wanted to stay in the ranks, to be the proof that excellence didn't require a different uniform. Colonel Thorne submitted his retirement papers shortly after the program's adoption. In his exit interview, he was asked about his greatest career regret. He cited the incident at Landstuhl. He was asked about his greatest achievement. He cited the Guardian Angel program. He left the Army with a subdued ceremony, his legacy forever split between the two. He now teaches medical ethics at a civilian university, where he uses his story as a case study in institutional failure and redemption. Private First Class Benji Miller was retrieved from South Korea. He received a commendation for his courage in writing his statement. He is now one of the first students in the new Advanced Tactical Medical Specialist course. The Board of Inquiry's findings were sealed, but the case it was meant to prosecute had evaporated. The Army, having adopted the very practices it was investigating, quietly closed the file. 2 years after the doors hissed shut in her face, Sergeant First Class Ava Cruz stood in a different operating theater. It was a demonstration for visiting NATO allies. On the table was a high-fidelity human simulator, programmed with a complex, multi-system trauma. The audience was filled with generals and senior medical officials. Her task was to stabilize the patient using the approved protocols she had helped write. She worked with calm, devastating efficiency. When the simulator's vitals stabilized, the lead surgeon from the British delegation turned to the American Surgeon General. Remarkable, her technique is it's not standard ATLS. It's more efficient. Where was she trained? General Preston smiled. She wrote the book, Colonel. The final, surprising detail emerged not from a document, but from a conversation. During the NATO visit, an older Swedish medical officer approached Ava. He had served in Bosnia. He said, "Your story, it reminds me of a debate we had decades ago about whether a brilliant medic is better than an average surgeon in the field. We decided the medic was, but we never had the courage to make it official. You did, and you did it from the inside." He paused. "The surgeon who started your Project Nightingale, Robert Aris, he consulted with us in the 90s. His ideas were considered radical, dangerous, even." Ava nodded. They were. The Swede leaned closer. He didn't just resign in protest, he was forced out. There was an incident in Somalia 1993, a Black Hawk Down scenario. A Delta medic performed a field thoracotomy, saved a life. The medic was reprimanded for exceeding his authority. Aris defended him publicly. The Army made him choose, retract his statement or resign. He resigned. Nightingale was his attempt from the outside to fix the problem. He needed someone on the inside to finish it. I think he knew it would take a soldier, not a surgeon, to win that war. Ava was silent. She thought of Liana Aris, the analyst, pushing the data. She thought of the mysterious secure drop messages. She had never been a pawn in a game. She had been the chosen instrument of a reform that was decades overdue, a rebellion planned by a man who had lost his career for the same principles. Her victory wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of a long campaign. She left the demonstration and walked through the hospital corridors, now a place of respect, not ridicule. She passed a young private first class mopping the floor. He saw her rank and her distinctive medical badge, and he snapped to attention. Sergeant First Class. As you were, she said. She stopped. You knew here. Yes, Sergeant, just assigned to environmental services. She looked at him, remembering herself. Keep your eyes open, you never know what you might learn. She continued walking, the sound of her boots echoing softly. The war was over, the work had just begun. And for the first time, the system was finally behind her, not in front of her. The story of the medic they turned away was now the foundational myth of the new way forward. And that change, cemented not by a single victory, but by a rewritten doctrine, was the only payoff that ever really mattered. So what's the real lesson here? It's not just a story about one medic or one arrogant surgeon. It's about the silent tax that every rigid hierarchy imposes. The tax paid in wasted talent, in unnecessary suffering, in lives that could have been saved if the person with the right skills had been allowed to use them. For decades, military medicine operated on a simple, unspoken rule. Rank and credentials were proxies for competence. Ava Cruz's story proved that in the dirt and the blood, those proxies are worthless. What matters is what you can do, not what your badge says. This pattern repeats everywhere. In corporations where the junior analyst with the breakthrough idea is ignored because she's not a vice president. In kitchens where the dishwasher who can cook like an artist never gets to touch the stove. In every system where we mistake position for ability and uniforms for worth. The Ava Cruz story is a flare illuminating a universal truth. Talent and wisdom are never distributed according to an org chart. The moment an institution forgets that, it begins to decay from the inside. The lingering question isn't whether she was right. The data answered that. The question is, how many other Ava Cruzes are out there right now, being told to go find a mop? How many systems are quietly self-sabotaging by sidelining their most capable people because they don't fit the traditional mold? Her victory created a new military occupational specialty, but the real victory was a shift in mindset. It proved that change is possible, even from the very bottom, if you have the courage to let the evidence speak louder than the ego. Today, the Advanced Tactical Medical Specialist course she helped create has trained over 200 medics. The procedures she performed under fire are now standard curriculum, and the survival rates for catastrophic battlefield injuries have improved by a measurable, documented percentage. That is her legacy, not a medal, but a methodology, not a promotion, but a precedent. As for the rest of us, the story leaves a challenge. Look around your own world. Who are you underestimating based on their title, their age, their gender, or their background? What unseen skills are being wasted because the gatekeepers are too busy guarding their status to notice? The next time you're tempted to judge someone by their uniform, remember the medic in the blood-spattered scrubs. Remember that the most dangerous assumption is the one you don't even know you're making. If you want more real stories that challenge what we think we know about power, skill, and hidden potential, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that button and turn on notifications because we bring you these deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.